He had dedicated his entire life to that land, pouring his heart and soul into every inch, but in a single, crushing moment, it was ripped away by developers, his dreams and legacy shattered. With no way to stop them, the farmer stood helpless, watching the land he loved slip from his grasp. Just as all hope seemed lost, the sound of helicopters filled the sky, and everything changed in a way he could never have imagined. Welcome to Untold Narratives. Let's get started. The farmer, John Adams, had known no other life but that of the land. His grandfather had plowed these fields, his father had tended to the crops, and now it was his turn. The fields stretched wide under the sun, golden and full of promise, a testament to the hard work of generations. Every furrow in the soil carried the weight of his family's legacy. Every seed he planted was a connection to the past. He spoke to the earth as if it were his closest friend, knowing it would yield in due time if treated with care. But now, that bond was under threat. Developers had come to town, their polished suits and glossy brochures an unwelcome presence on the dirt roads he had walked his entire life. They offered promises of progress, but John knew better. They wanted to tear down his fields to build something that didn't belong here. Houses, shopping malls, or whatever else served their bottom line. It wasn't just his livelihood at risk, it was his heritage, the very identity of who he was. He had refused their offer. Of course, how could he not? The price they offered was an insult, a mere fraction of the land's worth. His heart sank each time they came, trying to wear him down with their talk of money and development. They didn't care about the history of this place, about the sweat and blood poured into the soil. They only saw numbers on a page. But John wasn't just fighting for the land, he was fighting for something bigger. His belief in the right to protect what was his, to preserve the way of life he held dear. He couldn't let them take it without a fight, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The battle between John Adams and the developers had been going on for months now, and with each passing day, the reality of losing his land became more and more undeniable. At first, he thought he could stall them. He hired a lawyer, filed petitions, and even joined a few protests with the small but determined group of locals who stood with him. He thought the law, the truth of the land's value, and the moral high ground would be enough to stop the developers. But he had underestimated the power of money, the weight of corporate influence. As the weeks passed, John could feel the shifting tide. The developers' machines began to encroach on his fields. Surveyors, bulldozers, and cranes moving in, like an army of invaders. Their presence was a constant reminder of the losing battle he fought. He could no longer go out to the fields without seeing the creeping edge of development, gnawing at the very heart of what he'd spent his life building. One afternoon, John sat in his lawyer's office, staring at the bland contract the developers had pushed onto the table. The offer they presented was everything he had feared, an insult wrapped in legal jargon, a check for a sum far below the land's worth, a settlement that would strip him of everything he held dear. He could feel his hands tremble as he read through the fine print. The offer wasn't just unfair, it felt like a betrayal, a direct attack on everything he had worked for. But there was no room for negotiation, no middle ground. They made it clear, sell or face the consequences of a prolonged legal battle they could easily afford to win. The emotional toll was weighing on him like a heavy stone. John had spent sleepless nights walking the fields, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. The land had always been more than just dirt and crops to him. It was the embodiment of his life's purpose. But now, his world seemed to be crumbling. The field that had once brought him peace now felt like a prison, an anchor pulling him into a pit of despair. Every inch he fought for was slipping through his fingers. The developers had everything on their side: money, power, connections. What did he have? A stubborn belief that this land was his birthright. But in the cold light of reality, that belief wasn't enough. Days turned into weeks, and John's resolve was tested over and over. The offers kept coming, each one more persuasive than the last. The developers didn't just want his land, they were trying to break his spirit. John had his pride, his dignity, but even those were beginning to fray. Every time he turned them down, they countered with something more tempting, more convincing. He stood in front of his house one evening, staring out over the land, feeling the weight of his decision. His heart ached with every corner of his field that the developers began to tear into. Was he fighting for something that no longer existed, a dream that was slipping further from his grasp? The local news carried stories about the development project, interviews with local officials touting the benefits of the new shopping mall and luxury apartments. The community, once united in support of John, had started to divide. Some saw the developer's offer as a way out of economic hardship. Others, like John, saw it as a betrayal of everything the town stood for. The lines between friend and foe blurred as pressure mounted. The loneliness of his fight settled in, deeper than ever. Then came the day when the developers showed up at his farm with a final offer. The meeting took place on the porch of his old farmhouse, and John stood tall as they handed him the new contract, with a check attached, a check that was still far below what the land was worth, but far more than he had ever dreamed of making in a lifetime of farming. The developers spoke kindly, as if they were doing him a favor. "We understand your attachment to the land, Mr. Adams, but progress is inevitable. Think of what you could do with this money, a fresh start, new opportunities." It was a tempting offer, one that could free him from the burden of his battle. But the more he stared at the check, the more it felt like a betrayal of his entire life's work. Could he really sell out? Could he turn his back on everything that had been passed down to him through the generations? The land, his legacy, his identity. Was it all worth selling for a few numbers on a check? John felt his heart hammering in his chest. The inner conflict raged. The fight was becoming exhausting. Was it worth continuing? Could he afford to keep saying no? As the developer stood there, waiting for an answer, John's voice faltered. He couldn't bring himself to accept the offer. Not yet. But the longer he stood there, the more it felt like he was losing everything. His spirit, his connection to the land, and his very sense of self. It was then that the sound of helicopters broke through his thoughts. A distant hum, at first faint, then growing louder. His heart skipped a beat. It was an unusual sound for his quiet farm. He looked up, trying to make sense of it. In the distance, a cluster of helicopters began to emerge, their rotors cutting through the air in a way that felt almost like a sign. John squinted against the sun, his brow furrowing in confusion. What were they doing here? Helicopters had no place over his farm. They weren't the developer's machines. Were they military? Police? It didn't make sense. As the sound grew louder, the helicopters came closer, hovering overhead. John stood frozen, staring up at the sky. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The developers, momentarily distracted by the noise, turned their gaze upward. John's thoughts raced, but he couldn't make sense of what was happening. Was this the beginning of something new? An unexpected intervention? A twist of fate? For the first time in what felt like forever, John allowed himself to feel a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things weren't as lost as they seemed. The helicopters loomed larger, casting long shadows across his devastated fields. What did they mean? And why were they here now, of all times? The tension in the air was palpable. Something was about to happen, and John couldn't help but feel that this moment, this strange intervention, was the turning point he had been waiting for. The helicopters hovered just above the field, their rotors thundering in the sky like an approaching storm. John stood rooted to the spot, his eyes wide, unsure of what to make of this sudden turn of events. He had spent so many sleepless nights, staring at the horizon, hoping for some kind of intervention, but never in his wildest dreams did he imagine this would be it. The developers, too, were stunned, their polished faces flickering with confusion and disbelief. The large machines circled overhead, and the noise of their engines drowned out everything else for a moment, until one of the helicopters descended lower, coming to a gradual halt above the field. And then as the dust settled, a familiar face appeared at the edge of the field. John's heart skipped a beat. It was David, an old friend from his youth. David had once been a small-time lawyer in the local town, a man who had moved away years ago to work in a big city firm. He hadn't been in touch for years, but John never forgot the good man who had helped him with small legal matters over the years. David waved, signaling to John to come closer. With confusion still clouding his mind, John walked toward him, the weight of years of hard work pressing down on his shoulders. "David," John said in a hoarse voice, hardly believing what he was seeing. "What in the world is going on?" David smiled grimly, his eyes scanning the helicopters above. "I never thought I'd see the day, John. You've got an army of allies now, and the cavalry, it seems, is finally here." Before John could ask what he meant, a series of well-dressed men and women climbed out of the helicopters, their professional air unmistakable. They were joined by several individuals wearing press badges, cameras in hand, their presence suddenly making everything feel very real. The situation was escalating, far beyond what John could have imagined. David gestured toward them. "These people are from a group of activists I've been working with. We've been watching the developers for months now. They've been bending the law to suit their needs, displacing families, bulldozing farmlands without proper permits. We've been gathering evidence to expose the corruption, and today, we're finally ready to make it public. The media's here, the lawyers are here, and we've got a plan to stop them in their tracks." John felt his heart race as the pieces started to come together. He had no idea that David had been involved with such a group, let alone had access to the resources and networks that could challenge the developers' authority. But it was clear now that this was no coincidence. Everything, it seemed, was falling into place. As David spoke, the first helicopter landed gently on the ground. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, a well-known environmental lawyer, with a reputation for winning against corporate giants. He walked directly toward John, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Sam Pierce. I've been following your case, Mr. Adams. We've got evidence that the developers didn't follow the proper zoning laws. They've falsified documents to push their project through. It's illegal, and we're prepared to take this to court." John could hardly believe his ears. His first reaction was disbelief. Could this really be happening? But as the situation unfolded, his pulse quickened with a growing sense of hope. The world he had been fighting against for so long now seemed to be tilting in his favor. Sam continued, "This is just the beginning. We've already gathered enough proof to expose the developers' fraud to the public. We've got journalists here who are ready to cover the story. The media will be all over this. Once we make it public, there's no going back for them." John's hands trembled as he grasped Sam's hand in return, still processing the enormity of the situation. "Hi, I don't know what to say," John murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been fighting this fight alone for so long, and I thought it was over. But now, it's like the world is turning in my favor." As the group of journalists snapped photos and set up equipment, the activists spread out, organizing a peaceful demonstration in front of the developer's office. It was all happening so quickly, but the shift in momentum was undeniable. The developers, once so confident in their control, were now in retreat. The media coverage, along with the legal team's intervention, had the power to not only disrupt their plans, but to bring their unlawful activities into the public eye. Within hours, the news had spread. Headlines flashed across local news stations and websites. Developers' illegal actions exposed. Local farmer fights back with help of activists. The public backlash was swift. Local residents, who had been on the fence about the development project, now began to rally behind John, offering support in every way they could. Donations flooded in for legal fees, and people began organizing in solidarity. The developers, faced with growing public pressure and the threat of a lengthy legal battle, found themselves in an untenable position. The social media uproar and the mounting evidence against them made it impossible for them to continue pushing forward. What once seemed like an unstoppable force had suddenly come to a screeching halt. Weeks passed, and as the dust began to settle, John found himself in an unexpected position of power. His persistence, his refusal to give up, even when it seemed like all was lost, had paid off. The developers were forced to back down. They were sued for the illegal practices that had been exposed, and their project came to a halt. But it wasn't just the developers who were affected by the media frenzy, it was the whole town. As John's story became more widely known, it sparked a larger movement for accountability and transparency in local development projects. The public, inspired by his courage, began to demand stricter regulations and protections for farmland and local communities. As for John, he stood in his field once more, looking out over the land that he had fought so hard to keep. The weight that had been pressing down on him for months had finally lifted. His future was uncertain, but he no longer felt the crushing fear that had kept him awake at night. The land was still his, but now it was more than just a patch of earth. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for: justice, integrity, and community. With the developers out of the picture, the community rallied together to ensure the farm would remain intact. The local government even introduced new policies to protect small farmers like John from future threats of exploitation. John was once again the steward of the land, not just as an individual, but as part of something larger, a movement that was born from his persistence and the unexpected allies who had appeared when he needed them most. For the first time in months, John felt a sense of peace as he stood in the middle of his field. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the land that he had worked so hard to preserve. And as the wind blew softly through the trees, he finally allowed himself to believe that the fight hadn't just been for the land, it had been for something much more important: hope, and the belief that standing up for what's right can truly make a difference. John Adams had fought a battle that seemed impossible to win. For months, it felt like his dreams were slipping away, piece by piece. The developers, with their money, influence, and endless resources, had seemed like an unstoppable force. Alone, John could do little against their power, and it felt as though the land that had been passed down through generations would be lost forever. But just when the darkness seemed overwhelming, something unexpected happened: an act of kindness, an intervention from people he hadn't even known were watching. The helicopters, the activists, the media, it was as if the universe had conspired to bring him the help he needed, at the very moment he needed it most. The moral of John's journey is simple, yet profound: when you stand firm in the face of adversity, when you refuse to give in to the forces that try to break you, sometimes the universe rewards your perseverance in ways you can never predict. The help that came to John didn't arrive in the form he expected, but it came nonetheless, and it was enough to turn the tide. John's experience teaches us all that even when the odds seem insurmountable, even when we're standing at the edge of losing everything, we should never give up. The strength to keep going, to continue fighting for what's right, can bring about change, not just for ourselves, but for the community and the future we hold dear. Now, as John stood on his land once again, the weight of his struggle lifted. He knew that this victory was more than just the preservation of a field. It was the affirmation of everything he believed in. It was the triumph of justice over corruption, the power of community over greed. He had earned not just his land back, but a renewed sense of purpose. His connection to the land had always been strong, but now, it felt deeper than ever before. And with it, came a promise: no matter what challenges lay ahead, John would continue to stand firm, knowing that even in the darkest times, hope and support can come from the most unexpected places. If you believe in standing up for what's right, don't give up, no matter how tough the battle may seem. Share John's story, and inspire others to fight for what they believe in. Together, we can make a difference.